All right, welcome back. I appreciate you tuning back in for session number two of building or rebuilding a marriage God's way. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the right and the wrong way to deal with conflict, because ultimately this is a teaching series that pertains to how we communicate and how we resolve conflict, and then learn the tools and the skills to more effectively communicate. And so, as we think about building and rebuilding a marriage God's way, um, we have to ask the question, why does the conflict exist to begin with? And, one of the things to keep in mind is that, when you find yourself in a situation where there's a disagreement or there's some kind of conflict or debate, your spouse hasn't just made the scenario up because they love fighting, and I think a lot of times, we don't recognize that our spouse, their ideas and their beliefs and their feelings and their passions are every bit as, staunch or firmly held in their minds as, ours are in our own mind. And so, being able to kind of step out of our own, viewpoint and recognize that we're dealing with somebody who has just as concrete and a strong a conviction about how they're perceiving things as I do can really make a difference in starting to bridge the gap and learning how to find that common ground, that resolution. So, your spouse has a perceived need that isn't being met. And whether that's, being heard, whether that's being valued, whether that's, feeling like they're a priority, or whether it's, feeling like they're listened to, whatever it is, right? Your spouse has a need that isn't being met, that they're perceiving. And so we have to understand, how can we address the perception in their mind, right? Because it doesn't matter what I believe and what I can convinced of, and whether or not I think that they have valid, you know, ground to stand on. The question is, do they feel like their needs are being met? And without a clear understanding of the root cause of the conflict, the resolution evades us. And so it's really important when you start to deal with conflict resolution and you start trying to navigate, how do I get to the point of resolution? How do I get to the point where, my wife's needs, or in your case, maybe your wife or your husband's needs are being met to their satisfaction? That takes some intentionality and some work. And so the seemingly insignificant thing that triggered the problem sometimes isn't a real problem. It's just the last evidence that they felt they could take before reacting negatively or speaking out. And so if you've ever been in a situation, I know I have, plenty of times in the past, excuse me, where it's like the smallest of things, everything seems to be okay, at least from what I can tell. And then all of a sudden, it's the smallest of things, and it's like the situation just blows up. And it's like, in that moment, I used to think to myself, I don't understand what just happened. I mean, this was like such a small thing. How could that possibly have resulted in this big of a reaction or this big of a ordeal? And the thing that I used to fail to recognize is that that was just the very last thing to be tolerated. It was the accumulation of all of the small things, and in some cases, big things, that were going unaddressed and unaddressed. And you can only put so many bricks on the wheelbarrow before the wheel bursts. And so you have to learn not to look at every situation as just an isolated vacuum of its own little minute, moment. Because if there's not resolution ongoing, those situations are compounding, and the weight of that on the relationship is getting heavier and heavier. And so, you know, what is said can be interpreted differently by your spouse. And obviously, if you've been in a relationship for any amount of time, you recognize that sometimes what is said, or what is intended, and what is interpreted can be wildly different. But here's just an example. I have, a few examples here of things where one thing can be said, something like, "Hey, calm down, just relax." Not usually a good option. But what can be heard is something that sounds very dismissive, like your concerns don't warrant your emotions, right? If I'm telling you to calm down, relax, that means I'm saying you don't have a reason to not be calm or to not be relaxed. And so it sounds dismissive and sounds like I'm accusing you of overreacting, right? And if you say, "Well, that's crazy," I mean, that's just crazy. I can't even believe that. right? That can sound accusatory, like you're not making any sense. The way you're feeling or the things you're thinking, they're just illogical, and it's just, it's unfounded. Another thing that is commonly said is, I'm sorry you feel that way, right? And although this may have the guise of an apology, in most cases, from my experience, it doesn't usually provide the resolution that is necessary, because it's saying, I'm sorry that you feel that way, really is more of a statement of, your feelings aren't rooted in legitimacy. It's not my fault. Although I acknowledge you feel that way just for whatever reason you feel that way. It's not really because of anything that I'm accountable for or responsible for. And so it's also not usually helpful. And then, trying to give a long explanation why. Think about this. If I'm giving an explanation and I'm explaining and I'm explaining and I'm just, we're arguing and we're fighting and I'm trying to explain and you're trying to explain, and all that really says is, one, I'm justifying myself. Two, you don't understand, because the assumption then is that if you would just understand, you would recognize why I'm right, or why what I did wasn't wrong, or why whatever, right? It's like an attempted validation. And I used to struggle with this a lot, because I would just try so hard, because it seems so simple, it seems so plain and so sensible, and so like my viewpoint, my feelings, my understanding of the situation would seem so obvious, that I would try and try and try to explain it to my wife, not recognizing that the explanation isn't what's needed, because it's not a matter of her just needing to understand better. It's a matter of the fact that I don't recognize why she has a completely different viewpoint or outlook on the situation. And so just trying to explain more and explain more and explain more isn't the answer. And so just keep this in mind when you're running yourself into a conflict here, and you're having this conversation. You have to be careful to make sure that what you're saying isn't conveying a really negative interpretation by your spouse, because you're not choosing your words carefully or wisely. Because those things, especially in a moment of disagreement or argument, particularly if there's a history of kind of assuming that negative implication, it can have a really negative compounding effect. So there's some principles that I want to go over, and I've got a handful of different principles we're going to cover throughout this lesson, but these are some principles for communicating through conflict. It's the things you shouldn't do, right? These are the do nots of conflict resolution. And the first one is, do not speak in anger. And this one obviously is far easier to say than it is to do, because, in a moment of conflict or, heated discussion, it can be easy for the anger to just kind of creep in and take over without you having a whole lot of, control over it. And that's not good. But think about, I'm going to cover these verses as we go through these five principles. And the first verse is James 1:19, where it says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And so the idea is, we need to be listeners in pursuit of understanding and hearing, instead of people who are quick to make our own case. And that typically is done in anger, or, when somebody's seemingly not listening the way we want them to listen, it can cause us to get angry. And so first principle is, do not speak in anger. Principle number two is, do not hastily respond without listening. And this one is really, these are all good principles, but this one particularly can have some really negative effects if you're just, biting back comments or quickly responding when somebody's talking. You're not even listening. You're just kind of like waiting at the gate, ready to say your thing as soon as they have a pause. And so Proverbs 18:13 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Now, if you're sitting here with your spouse, hopefully you're sitting here with your spouse, because this is a great lesson for the two of you to both understand and start to learn from. But don't elbow them when you read through these lessons, because these videos hopefully will be a means of learning and of building skills together and learning to communicate more effectively and not just a reason to poke each other and instigate through the finger pointing. So don't respond hastily without listening. Principle number 3 is do not use harsh words. Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Nobody wants to get in an argument where somebody else is angry and it's just heated and argumentative. And so, if you want to avoid that, learn to not use harsh words because they definitely stir up anger. Excuse me. And then, principle number 4, do not be someone who doesn't know when to stop. And Proverbs 10:19, right? It says, when words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. And there's something to be said about recognizing when the conversation is starting to become unhealthy or kind of transition into a negative, unhelpful state. And being able to recognize that and then just put the brakes on and just say, you know what? I don't want this conversation to go poorly. I want to make sure that we're communicating effectively. I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. My emotions are getting involved in a way that I can tell is not healthy. And so I just need to pause, right? That's a good thing to learn. That self-control, which is one of the fruits of the spirit, is something that's very important when it comes to learning to communicate. And so, what often happens is with conflict moments or argumentative moments, it's just like, people are getting amped up and revved up, and next thing you know, words start flying, and then they start flying faster, and accusations come, and then we feel justified and we fire back. And before you know it, the things that were said during the conflict are far more damaging than whatever the disagreement was to begin with. And so now you've just compounded the situation and you're dealing now with the inability to take back something that we said that was far more hurtful than the reason you were even arguing in the first place. And it can just be a really damaging situation. And so you got to know when to stop, when to put the brakes on, and when to bite your tongue. And then lastly, do not engage in verbal retaliation. Romans 12:17 says, repay no one evil for evil. And although this verse is probably most of the time interpreted or thought of in terms of actions, it's very applicable in terms of how we use our words, right? If somebody is insulting you, if someone is using negative, connotations and insults, and don't repay evil for evil. Understand that you still have a calling before the Lord on how you are to communicate to your spouse, despite whatever they're doing. So I would encourage you to take some time, get familiar with these 5 principles. If you can learn to practice these 5 principles, it will help you tremendously in the communication efforts within your marriage. So let's look at some of the things we do want to do when it comes to conflict resolution. Here's some positive things that you do want to put into practice. The first one is taking every thought captive. Colossians 4:6 says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And there's a couple of important points in this verse here. The first thing is that your speech always be gracious, right? There's a certain characteristic that our words ought to carry in its graciousness. And it says seasoned with salt. And as you know, salt was a preservative of something that was supposed to be a benefit and preserve food and make sure that it doesn't spoil. And so our words ought to have a preserving component to it. And then it says, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And the implication here is that each person uniquely in any situation, there is a right way in which to respond and answer that person. And we ought to know how that is, right? And so we can't just take a cookie cutter approach, right? I know there's some, we'll get to this point here a little bit later in this presentation as well, but a lot of times we like to use just generic ideas. Well, women this or husbands that. And no, there is a specific way in which each person needs to be answered uniquely to that situation, and we ought to learn what that is. And we need to take every thought captive and make sure we're contemplating how our words can be gracious and seasoned with salt. Next thing is Psalms 141, verse 3. It says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. Now, if you think about this, what does a guard do? Right? Typically, you have a guard standing at the gate or at the door, and they make sure nobody comes in who's not supposed to come in. Right? And this is the same way with our words. We're supposed to have a guard at the door of our mouth so that no words come out that aren't supposed to come out. And if we're taking every thought captive, we're going to make sure with the guard over our lips that we are not saying things we ought not to say. And so this is a principle you have to put into practice. It's learning to guard your mouth. And then Ephesians 4:15, it says, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. And the emphasis in this verse is that it isn't that we're supposed to speak the truth, because there's lots of ways to speak the truth. The emphasis is that it's supposed to be in love. And I don't know if you have experienced this in your life. I certainly have. But when somebody's just blasting you with what they consider the truth, and then they caveat it at the end with, hey, I'm just speaking the truth. And it's like, well, maybe that's the truth. But we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that without love, it's just symbols. It's just like banging noise if we are not speaking with love. And so regardless of the truth you think you're claiming, if it's not being spoken in love, you're not following the Lord's instructions. So why do we fight over so many things? Man, I tell you what, my previous life, I felt like I had to ask this question all the time. It's like, man, why are we fighting over everything? It's exhausting, right? Praise the Lord for his mercy and grace. Here's the thing. If you're digging for gold, you find gold. If you're digging for dirt, you find dirt. Okay. And that's important. If you're in a situation where you or your spouse is just always on the lookout for the dirt, right? The dirt alert, people are on alert looking for the dirt. That's what you're going to find. And if that's what you're focused on, and you're constantly looking or assuming that the next thing they're going to say is, I'm sure they meant that the wrong way. Well, I know they meant that underhandedly, and I know you, right? Have you felt that way ever in your relationship? Because it's just like everything has that like underhanded, tone, and that double meaning in the implication of the words. And right, if you're training yourself to kind of always be picking up on that, you will find that even where it doesn't exist. And you have to really guard against that, because a relationship that's been hindered by negative communication for a long time will develop that as an undercurrent of all of our conversations. And so you got to be careful. You don't let that happen. What you focus on will have a heavy influence on what you notice. And it's just like, if you've ever felt like your spouse is just one negative criticism after another, man, all they do is point out the negatives and nitpick and complain, and got to be careful, because in some cases that may be true, and in other cases that may just be what your radar is set to see, right? It's like putting on those glasses. It's those undercurrent negative colored glasses where you see everything through that lens. And so be cautious you're not doing that with the communication in your relationship. But also, this is where it gets hard. You have to consider looking at yourself to see, is this how you communicate back to them? Right? It's easy to look and see, well, I know what my spouse does. Well, I know how my spouse is this. I know how my spouse is that. My spouse is always negative. My spouse is always complaining. It's a little bit harder to look at yourself and consider, is that how I'm behaving? You know what I'm saying? And I remember at a previous job, I was working and the plant manager was walking through, and I hollered at him because I wanted to talk to him. Ironically, I think it was probably something I wanted to complain about. But I saw him look at me, and he saw that it was me hollering, and he rolled his eyes and he sighed and he kind of headed over my way. And I realized in that moment, man, I have become the person that nobody wants to talk to because I'm so negative all the time. And I had allowed myself to become that person. And a lot of times, we drift. We drift in our attitudes and in our habits and in our focus. And the people that we once were, right? That's not the person we are anymore. And yet, so many people they grow up and they have this certain persona that they ascribe to themselves. And, then when they're 15, and then when they're 20, and when they're 25, and they're just so happy and they were so bubbly. We were so positive, and they labeled themselves, I'm an optimist. Yep, and I'm just a positive person. And then they just continue to self-ascribe those characteristics to themselves because they're the labels that they've attached to themselves, even if they're no longer true. Even the person who is completely negative and critical and sour, typically they don't see themselves that way. And so you have to be careful. You have to be willing to take an introspective look and ask yourself honestly, have I become that person who's negative all the time? And is my spouse having to deal with my constant negativity and pointing out criticisms and blaming and arguing and not being happy? Because maybe we've drifted. Maybe we've drifted, right? We have to be honest with ourselves. Lamentations 3:40. It's a great verse. It says, let us search out and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. There is something to be said about an honest self-examination where we ask the Lord to show us our weaknesses, show us our faults, show us where we're falling short, Lord. And then I just pray that you will help me to change in the ways that you want me to change. That is a powerful thing to do. And that is a request God will honor if you will humbly and sincerely ask it of him. So, how do they feel? Now, this is a question that I just have to say. I grew up in an environment where a person's feelings were considered, wayward. It doesn't matter how you feel, you gotta don't follow your feelings, you gotta follow the facts type of stuff. That was the kind of upbringing I grew up in. And so I was not very in tune to caring or recognizing how my wife felt. And if you ever asked your spouse, how do I make you feel? How do I make you feel? And then listen carefully for the answer, right? That is a revealing question. And I will tell you, you might be thinking to yourself, why in the world would I open that can of worms? I don't want to deal with all that, man. That's a 2 hour conversation. I'm just going to sit there and listen to all her griping and all his complaining. But just pause and think of this for a second. If the thought of asking your spouse, how do I make you feel? If that question brings in your mind the fear of a negative conversation, then that means you're aware of the fact that you're not making them feel very good, and yet you're not doing anything about it, right? And that's not okay. That's not okay. And so, whether you're the husband or whether you're the wife, if the idea of saying, how have I been making you feel? And then to sit there and sincerely listen for the purpose of understanding and learning and recognizing where you can do different so that you can make them feel better, that should be how we respond, right? So just contemplate that for a second. Does it matter to you how you make them feel? Or are you more concerned with whether or not their feelings seem justified to you? Now, isn't that just something we do? And I say we because I'm totally guilty of this, but isn't that, man, when somebody's in their feelings, their hurt feelings, or they feel whatever, dismissed, unheard, unvalued, right? These are all, terms that I've heard over years past from my wife. And so many times in the past, I was like, man, she has no reason to feel that way. Those are completely unfounded feelings. That is not the facts. I know the facts. I know that I come home and I know that I work hard and I provide and I this. And I can just pour all the self-justification as to why those feelings are not valid. And that doesn't matter one bit to making my wife feel better. It's completely wrong. And it's not being empathetic. And it's not going to help your relationship if you do not care how your spouse feels. Your spouse's feelings ought to matter a high degree to you. And, I kind of just mentioned this, but, telling my wife, there's no reason for you to feel that way. How does that make somebody feel? When you have a feeling, if you're feeling a certain way, you're feeling offended, you're feeling unheard, you're feeling, ignored or interrupted or insignificant. There's a whole ton of adjectives we can plug into that. You're feeling something negative, and then your spouse says, well, there's no reason for you to feel that way. Oh, well, good. Here, I thought I had a reason. I guess I feel better now. Right? That's not the response you get. Man, well, there's no reason for me to feel that way. I don't feel this way because I want to feel this way. I feel this way because the things that have happened, things that have been said, things that have been done, right? There's been reasons, at least in my mind, why I feel this way. And those feelings need to be addressed. And who gets to define the reasons, right? Are we the reason police? We get to say, oh, you don't have justification for that. Okay, that you do have reason to be justified for. So I guess I'll acknowledge that feeling. And right. And that just turns into a mess. It turns into a mess. Don't get into the trap of trying to decide when our spouses are allowed to feel a certain way because we deem the reason valid. That's a mistake. And honestly, that's going to just lead to somebody explaining and explaining and explaining and what feels like arguing because guess what? You just told them they don't have reason to feel the way they feel. And so guess what they need to do? They need to explain to you why they do have reason to feel the way they feel. And so it's counterproductive to, the situation to have that approach. And I love this quote. I don't know where this quote came from, but I love it. It says, the greatest cruelty is our casual blindness to the despair of others. I tell you what, that statement punched me in the face the first time I heard that. Greatest cruelty is our casual blindness to the despair of others. And when our spouse says, I don't feel okay, and we are not there to be empathetic and to do our best to figure out why and then do something about it, that is casual blindness, right? Casual blindness to the despair of others. And I assure you, many a time, our spouse, if they are feeling ignored, neglected, unheard, unvalued, despair, as strong of a word as that is, despair is exactly how that will lead to. There's many a spouse that feels in complete despair in their marriage. Don't let that be your spouse. You control whether or not that is your spouse. I shouldn't say you control it. You influence it. And we'll get to that. But you definitely influence it. And then this is a great definition by Carl Roger. It says the state of empathy or being empathetic is to perceive the internal frame or reference of another with accuracy and with the emotional components and meanings which pertain thereto as if one were the person. Now, this is a lengthy definition, but there's so much good stuff here. It's talking about the ability to perceive and recognize with accuracy what somebody else is feeling on the inside and to do it as if you're that person. And so he's basically saying, really well, you got to put yourself in their shoes and be able to feel what they feel because you can see things from their point of view. That's powerful. And that is a skill that if you can learn that skill, it will take you miles in your ability to communicate with your spouse. So let's get into talking about fault a little bit because this is another pitfall that happens when people, come across conflict is we just, well, it's your fault. It's your fault. It wasn't me. I didn't do this. It wasn't mine. It wasn't this. It wasn't, the arguments just take over and the finger pointing begins. And so and this is what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the internal dialogue because what's going on inside of your thinking is extremely important. And there's an incredibly strong dynamic that happens in the internal mindset of somebody when they're blaming versus when they're taking ownership. And so when somebody starts to point the finger and say, well, it's your fault, you did this. What you're saying is, I'm powerless to have influenced the outcome. It wasn't me, it was you. Right. And so it's kind of like shedding any responsibility, but it's also shedding any ability to have done anything. It's like I couldn't have done anything different. I have no options. I had no recourse. I'm not responsible for anything in this situation. It just happened to me. This was on you. Right. So there's very much a victim mentality when it comes to blaming somebody else, because no matter what somebody else does, the interaction or the way that I respond to them is still in my control. I still have the ability to be calm. I still have the ability to use my words carefully. I still have the ability to control my tone and to make sure that I'm, keeping a gate or a guard at the door of my mouth and all the things we've talked about up until this point. But when somebody takes ownership and the internal dialogue says, no, there is a way that I can influence this. I can do something here. I can carefully use my words. I can carefully use my tone, right? I have options to choose a different outcome. And so I'm going to put some energy into thinking about how I can choose a different outcome. I'm responsible for how I influence the situation, and my choices could make the situation better. And so therefore, I'm going to act and speak with that in mind. Those are wildly different approaches to conflict and to resolution. And if you can imagine two people, which oftentimes in struggling marriages, you have two people who are in the blame side of this equation. And so they're both saying it wasn't my fault, it wasn't me, I couldn't do anything different, I didn't do anything wrong, and you did this. And there's no progress made there. But on the other side, if you had two people who were both saying, no, I'm responsible. No, okay, well, I'm responsible too. And so I need to be careful with my words. Yeah, I need to watch my tone and I shouldn't get angry. Yeah, I know. And I shouldn't say what I said. And, and both people are contributing with responsibility that I'm going to do something different to cause a better outcome. It's a powerful shift in what starts happening within your marriage. Powerful shift. And so, let me go back on that slide just a second. It says, what does resolution look like to you? And this is another important principle, because what resolution looks like to you will determine what actions you take to get it. And so if your definition of resolution is just ending the fight, well, guess what? All I got to do is figure out how to make this conversation end, and I have resolution, right? If that's your end goal, and I can tell you, there was times in my past that was my end goal. I just wanted the conversation to end, so I would just sit there in silence. This was me. Let me show you a picture of me fighting. That was me fighting. Just tuned out, not engaging, um, waiting for it to be over, right? That's not resolution. That doesn't resolve anything. And if you think about, what would constitute the situation being satisfactorily resolved for both of you, not just yourself? Because let me ask you a question. What does your spouse need in order for there to be resolution? Do you know what makes your spouse feel like they received resolution? If you don't know that, how are you ever going to help them get it? You won't. You won't. And so you have to consider, is resolution for my spouse as important as resolution for myself? And it should be. It should be. You guys should both be seeking to accomplish resolution for one another. And if your approach is, well, when it's over for me, it's over. I'm done. I'm done with this conversation, right? Or a lot of times there'll be people who will be like, I said I'm sorry. What else do you want? I said I'm sorry. Right? Well, guess what? Sometimes saying you're sorry isn't everything that's needed to bring resolution to the situation. And so just saying I said I'm sorry, and then just like checking the box and being like, okay, now I'm done. I'm over. That's it. We're moving on. There's no resolution. So it's not actually over for your spouse. All you're doing now is you're putting your spouse in a terrible situation where they feel hurt, they feel a negative emotion, and the only person that can help them resolve it refuses to talk about it anymore. And then we get frustrated when our spouses seemingly don't have that nice happy glow. Why do they not have the nice happy glow? How come my spouse doesn't want to ever have sex anymore? Well, probably because there's unresolved problems. And nobody wants to do that when there's unresolved problems. And so think about this verse, Proverbs 12:18. There is one who speaks rashly like the thrusts of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And there's two things that are really important in this verse. The first one is the severity of the negative words. They are like thrusts of a sword. And if you don't know this, thrust of a sword will kill you. They are significant wounds. And it says on the flip side of that, the tongue of the wise brings healing. And the important part of this verse is that the healing talked about is for somebody else. It's not for yourself. You don't bring healing to yourself with your words. You should bring healing to the other person. And in this case, obviously, the context is your spouse. Your words should bring healing and resolution to your spouse, to the point where the negative feelings and the emotions that existed no longer carry forward. And maybe you can say, yeah, that's how we discuss things. We put it to rest, and when it's over, we make sure that it's over for both of us, and then we don't have to carry that negativity forward. But other people are like, man, my backpack's so heavy I can't carry it anymore. I got to drag it. I got a Red Ryder wagon behind me full of baggage. Why do you think that is? It's because things aren't getting satisfactorily resolved. The resolution isn't complete. It's just ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. As long as I pretend it's not there, I can just act like it didn't happen. The problem is your spouse can't pretend like it's not there because they're carrying a heavy load. And if you've ever, if you find yourself in a situation where it's like, man, it's just like every little thing is like a blow up. Every little thing's a trigger. It just constantly, I can't do anything right. And all of a sudden we're talking about the past again. We're talking about the past again. I can't tell you how many couples I've counseled who are talking about how they can't seem to let the past go. The spouse just won't let the past go. It's because it's never been resolved. The past has never been resolved. You gotta you got to settle it. You got to be willing to give the reconciliation that settles it so they don't have to carry it forward. And guess what? They're not supposed to carry it forward. They're supposed to forgive. But guess what? It's not that easy. And so it's easy to stand here and wave a Bible at them and talk about how you're supposed to forgive. You're supposed to forgive. God said forgive. Well, you know what else? God says a lot of other things that we're talking about, like your words are supposed to bring healing, right? You're not doing that very well either. So before we start casting stones back and forth, let's recognize that there's responsibility on both sides. Okay. So here's some more principles for responding well to conflict. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood, right? If you can say, before I make my case, before I argue my point, before I try to tell you why I this and I that, let me understand why you think and feel the way you think and feel. I want to know your perspective, right? Imagine if two people came to a conversation with that attitude. It wouldn't be conflict. It wouldn't escalate. It would be well navigated. And another important point is to keep current with each other and don't allow the negative feelings to pile up, as we discussed a little bit, right? Hebrews 12:15 says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble. Because guess what happens when unresolved conflict stays just right behind us? It's just right there, right? We didn't resolve it. It's just kind of right there in the ground. It's described as a root of bitterness. And if you've done any gardening, I like to garden, but guess what? I can't seem to get rid of all of my weeds because the roots, man, they're just so prevalent. You just, no matter how many of them pull up, it's like there's always more of them. That's that's how bitterness acts. when we have unresolved conflict that is allowed to fester and grow under the surface and stay in the ground and keep spreading the roots until the point where you can't pull it out with your hand anymore. Now you got to go get the shovel and you got to tear up the yard, all kinds of ways in which it's like, man, this doesn't even look like grass anymore. I've got nothing but a dirt pile because I had to dig it up so bad. And many relationships are leveled to a dirt field because the weeds were allowed to fester. The humorous side of me had to include a quote from Tim McGraw. I'm sorry. Always be humble and kind. But I have scripture to back that up. 1 Peter 3:8-11, it says, to sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble. There it is, in spirit, not returning evil for evil, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called to this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. And if you can just think about these words, and these words were written between, Christians, brothers in Christ, sisters in Christ, and yet how much more should this be applicable to our spouses? And it says, be harmonious, be sympathetic, be brotherly, kind-hearted, humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil. Right? We already talked about that a little bit. But instead of that, not just don't do it, instead give a blessing, because it's super easy when someone's being critical to just shut down. I can just shut down. I already showed you how easy I can sit there in quiet and silence and just wait. But I'm supposed to be giving a blessing instead. That's not so easy to do. This is why a walk with the Lord is absolutely necessary for a strong marriage, because otherwise, if we're operating in our flesh, if we're not walking by means of the Holy Spirit, we will never accomplish this high calling. Can't be done. John 15 said, apart from me, we can do nothing. We cannot bear fruit if we are not abiding in the vine. Another principle to remember, resolution takes time, right? And I'll tell you this, there's been times in my marriage where over the past probably 5 years where I've really learned, or I shouldn't say learned as in the past tense, as I've been learning, present tense, to communicate better and to find true resolution. I can't hurry it, right? Because sometimes conversations take a while. And I remember one time my wife and I had a disagreement. It was a pretty strong disagreement, and we got into a pretty heated conversation. And this was probably like 8 p.m., right? It was before bed. And next thing you know, it's arguing and it's carrying into the night, and we're talking and we're talking and we're talking. But we wouldn't stop talking until we figured this thing out. And I remember it was like almost 4 a.m. when that conversation ended, but it ended so sweetly. There was harmony, there was resolution, and it took a long time to work through it and to overcome the assumptions and to overcome the feelings and the all of that. It just took so much time. And then somewhere in the middle of the night, it was like, it just kind of clicked. And it was like, I didn't understand what you were trying to say. And I was so responsive negatively to what I assumed you were trying to say. It took time. It took time. And we can't hurry up the conversation, because the goal has to be absolute addressing of the needs of the spouse in a way that they can interpret as meaningful and satisfactory. And Ecclesiastes 7:8-9 says, the end of a thing is better than its beginning. That's how it should feel when you have a conversation and you work through a situation. It should feel better at the end than it felt at the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit, and do not hasten your spirit to be angry, for angry rests in the bosom of fools. And this is not just an application to the length or the duration of a single conversation, but it also has to do with the length and duration of how long it takes in the relationship to build it back to healthy. You cannot assume that it's going to happen in a week or even a month, because relationships don't deteriorate in a week or in a month. It takes a long time, where a lot of negative habits and things take place, where eventually you find yourself all of a sudden like, man, all of a sudden it just turned terrible. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. It started to get bad a long time ago, and it wasn't addressed, and it wasn't fed. And so now you find yourself in a place where it's not good. And even in a situation where it's like maybe there was an infidelity, and it's like, no, it went south in one day, in one night, it was over, it was wrecked. Even in that situation, that infidelity, the thought of it, the possibility of it, didn't start in a day, right? The seeds of that were planted long before that time with sinful thoughts and sinful desires and unmet needs and maybe a feeling like the marriage wasn't being attended to and there was maybe some neglect feelings and like not saying any of that is legitimized or okay, but recognize in any time there's a marriage that's not healthy and thriving, it happened over time and not in a moment or a day. And therefore, it takes also time to build it back. So have the patience to allow the other person because one of you needs more time than the other. That's just a fact. There's no way both of you are going to just need the exact amount of time. And, by the way, in 4 weeks on a Tuesday, at 2 in the afternoon, we're both going to feel like we're ready. No, one of you is going to feel like you need more time. And the one of you is going to need to give that more time if you want it to get back to good. Another principle to remember, resolution must be complete and thorough to avoid negative emotional carry forward. Think of this. Matthew 5:23 and 24 says, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. How much more should this principle apply to your spouse? And I've been guilty of this, right? I'm not throwing stones because everything I've been teaching in these lessons is stuff that I learned the hard way, and most of it I've been guilty of myself. So I understand there's been times when my wife was hurting, my wife was upset, and you know what? I'm not going to deal with it. So I'm going to go off and do something else. I'm going to go play the guitar, or I'm going to go do something that's my hobby, something that I enjoy, and I'm just going to take care of my own distractions. That's not okay. I'm supposed to set reconciliation as the priority ahead of even bringing the gift to the altar at the temple, right? Even ahead of that, reconciliation is supposed to be the priority, right? So don't act like it's okay to put off reconciliation and resolution for a day or a week, or we'll get to it. You know what? It's been this way for this long. Oh, it's not going to kill us to wait another couple of days. That's a wrong attitude. This needs to be a priority. Unresolved conflict is what leads to the scenario where every little thing sets the situation off again. And if this is your situation, one or both of you are carrying around negativity in your mind, and the unresolved conflict or issue is just right under the surface, still simmering strong. And the unresolved feeling will be the lens that the rest of your interactions get seen through. Right? If you feel like the temperature or the tone, or there's just like this awkward tension, right? It's just like, I gotta be careful. If I say one wrong thing, it's gonna be gone. We're gonna go in the total wrong direction. That's the indicator that there's unresolved issues. And so instead of tiptoeing around or walking on broken eggshells, deal with it, resolve it, address it. Don't just ignore it. And be honest with yourself. Does your relationship have unresolved conflict? And you know what? If you're not sure about it for yourself, ask. Ask your spouse, do we have unresolved conflict? Because I guarantee you, if you, in sincerity, convince your spouse that you have a desire to resolve the conflict that's unresolved, they're going to want to resolve it with you, right? They may not want to resolve it with you at first, but that's because they either don't believe you're sincere or they don't believe that it's going to be real change. And so there may be some time where they need some evidences to convince them that you're serious and you're sincere and you mean what you say. However, if you can come to them with sincerity and humility and say, you know what, I recognize that I haven't been resolving and I haven't been taking care of the hurts and the feelings that you've had, and I want to fix that. Can we please fix that? That's going to get you a long way. All right. The biggest difference, this is just something that I've thought through and I think it's worth sharing, so I included it. Biggest difference between an optimist and a pessimist is the memories they choose to carry. And if you think about that, just let that soak in for a minute, because a lot of times we ascribe these labels, or you're an optimist or you're a pessimist. You know, my wife thinks I'm more of a pessimist. But nonetheless, it just comes down to what do you choose to focus on and remember? Because if you're somebody, it's not that pessimists are just people who have just had all the things wrong in their life, right? And they've never just had any, nothing goes ever goes right for the pessimist. It's just always wrong. That's not true. They just don't recognize the good parts and they focus on the bad parts. They dwell on the bad parts. And so when they think about what's going to happen now or what's possible now or what, might, develop in the future, they tend to assume it's going to be more negative because negative is what they focus on. And that is a little true of me, by the way. But on the other side, an optimist is somebody who chooses to look for the more positive things, right? It's not a choice. I should say, it is a choice. This isn't just like something where like I'm born this way and I can't help it. No, this is a mindset that we develop over the course of our lives, and then we either choose to continue in that or we start to change it. We all have struggles, difficulties, disappointments, but we have to guard against letting those things become the viewpoint which colors the rest of the world and the entirety of our relationships. Because if we allow it to, it will sour everything. And I really like this quote from Winston Churchill. He says, "Success is moving from one failure to another without losing enthusiasm." Now, think about that in the context of your relationship. Have you lost enthusiasm in your relationship? Do you remember when you were dating? It was exciting. And then you got married and it was exciting and you were in love and it was awesome. And then over time, maybe that started to wane a little bit. And then over more time, maybe it was like, man, it's not quite like it used to be. He doesn't look at me the same, or he doesn't talk to me the same, or it's just like we're just so busy with life, and it's just, it's just not there anymore. And now it just seems like all we do is fight, and it's just, we're just so busy with the kids, and it's just right, and we just lose enthusiasm. We're not supposed to allow the negativity, the failures, as I will refer to them only because it's in this quote, the difficulties should not cause us to burn out. And we have to be careful and let ourselves be honest with ourselves that, you know what, maybe I've burned out a little. Maybe I need to give a little bit more to the marriage than what I'm giving because I'm not giving what I used to give. And that's a tough acknowledgement to make to yourself, but that's the truth sometimes. And so be willing to speak that truth if in fact that's the case. Be willing to acknowledge it and take ownership for the fact that maybe you're not contributing to the marriage the way that you used to. Maybe you're not contributing to the marriage the way that your spouse believed that you would based on the way that you acted in the beginning of the relationship. And I know that stings. And I hope wives and husbands, you're not elbowing each other on that statement. Like, yeah, see, you're definitely not the same guy. You lied to me. You painted this pretty picture and you made all these promises and you made me feel like it was going to be a certain way. And it's not. You're not the same guy at all. You're not the same woman at all. I'm not saying that to start a fight. I'm saying that for yourself to contemplate and look in the mirror and ask yourself, have you lost enthusiasm? And is there to some degree a level in which you need to re-engage in your marriage? Don't let the struggles of the past contaminate the opportunities of the future. And I promise you, if you will take these principles, put them into action, the opportunities of the future is exactly what they are. The future is one giant opportunity to revolutionize your relationship with each other and with the Lord. It's just an opportunity, and you choose what you're going to do with it. But it absolutely is an opportunity. And so I hope that this video is kind of a nice follow-up to the way we talked about the difficulties and the pitfalls and the challenges of communication. And now in this video, we talk a lot about how we handle conflict. And there's some right ways and there's some wrong ways to deal with conflict. And so I would really encourage you, go back through this content because this is a lot of material to digest and to put into practice all at once. It's very difficult to, process all this in a way where at the very next time you have a conflict, the very next time there's a need to put this into practice, you're going to smoothly and accurately remember all the things that you need to put into practice. It's going to take more familiarity with this content in order to do so. So take some time, work through this with your spouse, be honest and transparent with one another. And I told you this in the last video. I'll tell it to you again. I will be praying for the relationships and the marriages out there who are engaging with this content and seeking to honor the Lord and honor one another in your marriages. And so I hope you're appreciating and finding value in this content. And with that, until next time, have a great night.